There was once a mystic who had two things he could talk about. Either things that he wanted to talk about or things that other people wanted to hear talked about. Are we talking serious quandary here, folks, or what? Where the alert seek expansion, the simple think, how can we reduce the possibilities? And where the simple do search for additional answers and solutions, the alert have put a prize on palaver's head. There passes unnoticed, quite commonly, a most tenuous and spotty connection between subjects produced by the mind and its subsequent attempted analyzation thereof. Like a magician pulling a rabbit from an empty hat and presenting it as proof of, among other possibilities, aggression's social origins. A man named Alonzo's personal motto is, well, slap me silly and call me Alonzo. There's nothing quite as reassuring than a good dose of efficiency. When caught again out behind the mental barn, one boy asked his father, well, can I just wear glasses till I go blind? A traveler on the train sat by a window and thought, well, even if I never do get to Istanbul, if I keep my face pressed to the glass, staring out, maybe I'll never notice. The tricky thing about mental operations in a reality of even-numbered dimensions is that what seems to be proper and efficient at one level can keep you from exploring potentially better ones. Who said that life was fair, other than life? Oh, I'm sorry. You thought somebody else did? Sorry. On one world were two types of radios produced. One was wired to receive all broadcasts slightly scrambled, and the other was not. One of these constituted the majority, and the other one did not. A man pondered, is the fact that the norm's never funny, is it a fact that the norm's never funny, or that the norm can never see itself as possessing any humorous attributes? In conditions of routine reality wherein presides the illusion of mental balance, seriousness will always prevail over non-seriousness, and sanity appear logical, and only the logical sane. In one galaxy was a world that was close to another world, which knew nothing of its existence. Another reason that 2 + 2 can continue to be whatever the mind finds agreeable. Whenever this one interstellar warrior's consciousness would begin to take on star-like qualities, he'd say to it, okay now, don't make me horny. Under routine Earth conditions, functions misconstrued continue to do what they've always doed. Oh. One conductor on the mythical express would let no passenger sit next to him who could not continually keep in mind their destination of Istanbul. After some years, he wouldn't even sit next to himself. The reason you can't trust tales regarding the hardships of the great quest is because they're generally written by those who failed. None preach but to themselves. A certain king told his son, never listen to anyone I might send you to. That knight can adequately feed himself and properly survive who, in those barren areas, give no notice thereto. The fact game is played out in earthly gems. As long as you continue to mix it up with the mind, you'll always remain in a clinch therewith. The first law of even-numbered universes is sticky. Make it sticky. Maybe a change in locale will help. The simple can only distinguish themselves amidst the collective by excessive large body parts. So then, how come the more conscious? So then, how can the more conscious? And why would they want to? One man wondered if this was a trick question, but he should know damn well by now that any question at all worth considering has got to be a trick. In this one really peculiar reality, things are arranged such that 4-foot-tall creatures never 4'9". In this one area, in this one really peculiar reality, things are arranged such that 4-foot-tall creatures never 49 inches see. As he surveyed the squares, the men, and the moves spread before him, one king said to the bishop, "It's either all a trick or else none of it is." In man's mental airways, life can tolerate spasmodic supertransmissions, just as long as it keeps a cap on the number of potential receivers. According to one legend, the Great Mother Mystical School turns out two types of students: those who talk about what they've learned and those who don't. And one of the two didn't actually learn much. A chap riding the Mythical Express turned to a stranger in an adjoining seat and whispered, "As much as I enjoy this, sometimes it gives me cold chills that you wouldn't believe." From the hoary annals of extreme folklore comes a bit of proverbial health wisdom which says that the primary way by which knights catch colds, the flu, and other non-fatal but distracting ills is by too often opening their mouth. While surveying the rhetoric of his mind, one man mused, "Punctuation doesn't mean anything if you're not going anywhere." In a land of self-reference, a man cannot be referred to anything new or of consequence. Yes, if you're not headed anywhere, nothing amounts to anything in particular. Certain men at certain times have been heard to say that they frighten themselves. But amongst the ordinarily dazed and distracted, such fear is of low intensity compared to what it would be should they ever see what self actually is. Proverb extension. Instead of asking, "What would it profit a man should he gain the whole world yet lose his soul?" it would be better said for the few, "What will it profit you to learn all about something that scarcely exists?" Socrates may have seemed strange and oblique, but at least he knew when to get the hell out. Yet how dearly do faux mystics adore the idea of martyrdom. The majority of what the mind thinks seems so serious, which is what makes it so ridiculous. Another difference between an alert man and everyone else is that when an alert man suddenly realizes that he is not being one, it bothers him. On a certain faraway planet, periodically pops up unusually strong and tall radio transmitting stations and towers to which many creatures are able to tune. Life sometimes allows some things to occur in some places that it won't in others. As told by one legend, there was once a knight who was the greatest of them all, and his name was Sir Grease-a-Lot. Explaining his lack of interest in things psychiatric, said one man, "I figure as long as I have a mechanically running mind that I'm in some sort of therapy, whether I want to be or not." Train station justice. Those who never actually get on the Mystical Express are yet those always most ready, when asked, to hop aboard. This, the prime reason the hectoring calling out of departures done by conductors turned preachers works. On one intelligent planet, unbeknownst to the inhabitants, there is an unseen thought depository from which all draw their everyday ideas. Upward modulation. In all intelligent universes, the thinking creatures are driven by a common force. Oblique expansion. Self-taught individual thinking creatures understand all of the above and are thus, on good days, partially freed therefrom. Footnote, never in a closed system ask for a conclusive definition of freed. For the few, loosed might better do. A man in his mind had a contest to see who was strongest. Guess who won? But even after its victory, his mind still wouldn't try it with the body. Guess why? It's easy to cry at the thought that you'll die, but harder to grin over the possibility that you've just started to make yourself live. The way to tell whether you are in a warrior cemetery or one for civilians is that in the case of the latter, all of the headstone statuary is frowning and looking serious. A reconsideration of the debts mortals imagine owed to the gods. A man who understands the nature of life has no additional need to feel put upon by life. Another distinction between a knight and an ordinary person is that while the ordinary will often claim to recognize their responsibility and the hardships it carries, the warrior finds his duty to be as natural and effortless as his breathing. The redemption, the salvation through sacrifice so often dreamed of by men, more fully understood, is not first off so much a matter of repair and repentance of flaws as it is a question of comprehending the natural proper state of man. The redemption, the salvation through sacrificial death so commonly spoken of by men is, when more fully understood, less a question of who will die that I may live, and more of how am I to permanently die to myself and all of my natural notions of what constitutes an acceptable state of man. The overlooked purpose of myth, other than to help make the hidden possible to see, is to render the obvious damn near invisible. You can read about yourself in the paper, hear about yourself on the phone, but you don't know who you are till you're with your mind alone. The game of consciousness, as played by ordinary minds, is a collective team sport. But for a few, it becomes something much more personal and individual. Looking back over the manuscript of his life thus far, one man thought, the key word therein seems to be, well, there doesn't seem to be one. Although Istanbul is never like anyone imagines it to be, that's all right. No one can imagine what it's really like anyway. As he stepped across the vestibule from one car to another, one passenger paused to ponder whether or not he might actually be carrying Istanbul already with him. I feel obliged to point out to you that he is not the first would-be traveler to have this possibility pass through his mind, but a more promising way to approach it might be to picture that mythical Bosporan city as being one impossible to map. One chap volunteers the fact that the similes and comparisons he most enjoys are those which are inequitable, askewed, and unbalanced. That might give you something to think about next time you see signs pointing to Turkey posted by two-rail tracks. Some journalism news from the city room. The mind is to consciousness like a rewrite editor. A man in a cafe laid down his paper and asked a knight at the next table what he thought of a certain event covered in the latest edition. And the warrior shook his head, signaling his ignorance thereof, and said, I don't subscribe. And the man noted to the knight that he hadn't even looked to see exactly which paper he was reading and referring to, and the warrior replied, it's no matter. I do not subscribe to anything occurring out there. Why buy a paper when you can get the news free through the fence? Sometimes there are just not enough would-be mystical listeners from the Deep South to get some of these metaphors. Or perhaps they are and you just don't admit it. The thoughts of the simple are tied closer to the body than to the mind, while the thoughts of the city sophisticates are tied closer to their mind than to reality. Each time this one explorer would believe himself drawing close to the prize, he would, in advance, to compensate for any possible miscalculations on his part, mentally move the grail further away. Take note that moves such as this, made by those who know, are not for the purpose of self-confusion, but rather as a reminder that Istanbul, indeed, can never be adequately mapped. One day, accidentally getting his telescope turned backwards, a student of the heavens concluded that the universe got the idea for a closed system from observing the mind of man. One benefit of being ordinary is that whether trains run forward or backward is of no consequence to you. The Grail, the prize of the mystical quest, was originally called attention. After local conditions so long pestered life for some additional help in its responsibility of protecting a certain secret, it was given permission to label some things as holy and sacred. Amidst man's routine city existence, a thing misnamed is a thing made safe. A two-eyed number in the land of quartets might ultimately as well be blind. As regards a man attempting to bring his collectively produced consciousness somehow under his own control. A would-be mystic in the midst of life is like a radio that's been tossed into the sea. Second verse, regarding a man attempting to bring his collectively produced consciousness under his own direction. A would-be mystic in the midst of life is like a radio that's been tossed into the sea and who realizes it. Every morn do men arise, believing that this may be the day wherein the secret is revealed unto them. They believe this, not realizing that they awake each day serenely in the arms of this elusive creature. The awakening, as would be experienced on a merry-go-round, would be like one horsey entering and passing through the one just ahead, only to realize that it was him all along. The ordinary attempting to make sense of the world of mystical metaphor is almost as funny as them trying to make sense of the everyday world. Additional note regarding an unsuspected balancing act. For every nightly order known, there's another one not. Even at superhuman levels, life's primary safety factor remains redundancy. But still no need to let it be yours. Everything in man's routine mental world is a case of after the fact. A mystic's message is always in part anachronistic and always in full in the forward direction. A final word regarding the subject of seriousness. Anyone who takes their personal life to be a matter thereof has missed a certain train that they never even knew existed. And finally, a man once said to a mystic, I guess the dirtiest trick life's ever played on men is in not letting most of them realize they could achieve another, more refreshing state of consciousness. To which the alert one responded, either that or letting a few realize they could. One man cautioned himself to never let his mind tell him what time it is. Several of the stories tonight dovetail with what we were talking about last time regarding the norm, the majority, looking at man's intellectual life, his mental life as being a populace, an area of individual people is a metaphor. The fact that the majority, the norm inside of a person's thinking processes is not funny. It sees nothing humorous about itself. And many of the implications thereof, all of which I have not upon touched. Both of those areas also can be nicely related to several questions that someone interested in these proceedings recently asked me, the responses to which they seem to find beneficial and enjoyable. Thus, I shall take the opportunity, as we say in the transcendental trade, to smoosh them all together. Without benefit, I might add, of a wearing blender, unless Fred showed up. Well, some of this is going to start off the questions and related to, at the outset, what appears to be references to actual occurrences, actual people, historical events. In other words, the world out there. And as you know, I would not be bringing it up unless I can make these examples and instances referring to the world out there carry a deeper allegorical potential. The question arose, the question rhetorically speaking at least, about how this kind of information, which would be in conflict with the norm, with the majority of thought, of thinking of ordinary people, that how life protects itself, and does it not in some way subdue, if not eradicate, take overt action against it. And the questionnaire brought up such subjects, such examples as Jesus, Socrates. Now, even I, in some of the news items, have made references that could easily, and at the time, not incorrectly, be taken as some reference thereto. You understand, the question was, when it comes to information that's not part of the norm, when it comes to things said that does not fit into the majority of thought, that does not fit into the majority's conception of reality at the time, does not life deal with it in harsh ways? All right, let's take the easy examples, and there, believe me, thousands of others. But these obvious examples would be like a Jesus being crucified, or a Socrates, in essence, being crucified, put to death, even though by his own hand, at his own choosing. Consider this. There's 4 or 5 things in here. One of them is also note how would-be mystics have always and continue to love the whole notion of martyrdom, literally. If you ever want to check out whether anybody knows anything or not that appears to be, if they're dressed like a mystical duck and they're walking like a mystical duck, and you think, well, they might actually know something, all you got to do, bring up the subject of martyrdom and the hardships up with which they have had to put due to their great calling. And if they nibble at all, tuck up your skirts and run for it. But faux mystics, there's an obvious way to consider that, by the way, is when you're having less than success in your would-be mystical efforts by your own definition, by your own feel, falling back to the ideas of a Jesus or a Socrates, and most of them would pick Jesus, in case you'd like to think about that in your spare time. Very few people ever pull out the example of Socrates in any way related to areas transcendental and metaphysical. So they would probably pick out Jesus, no doubt, and say, well, you see what happens. A man begins to speak the truth too strongly, and there's no telling what will happen. You understand, to a would-be mystic, having less than a glaring amount of success, that is, attracting less than adequate numbers of followers to his call, that is always a reassuring notion that, well, perhaps I should be glad, because if I indeed began to push this too far and I began to insist that the public listen to the truth from me, you know, hey, who knows? I could come to an ill end. At any rate, that's the notion of the glory of martyrdom is not carried on historically by people of any understanding, certainly not by martyrs, certainly by no one of any even routine intelligence, by the way, if you want to point it out. Because if you just take an ordinary person, just a sane bricklayer, accountant, waitress person, and say, what do you think about the idea of dying for your beliefs? And they might not want to offend, but if they had no reason to think that you had some religious agenda in mind. If you just tried to ask it as a clinical question, no matter what they say, I assure you, check with yourself, their idea is like, well, that's kind of nutty. You know, that's too weird to really think about. By that I mean, would they do it? No. And they cannot really conceive of it. So anyway, the notion of martyrdom continues to be supported and carried forth through history by a very small and identifiable group of people, and not people to be admired or emulated in any way. Back to the main subject. The question presented rhetorically was, does not life, or isn't it true that life won't put up with this, or that life will take overt action against someone doing this? There would seem to be validity in that. And it would seem that the stories of a Jesus or Socrates, and as I said, 1,000 others, some of you probably know a few minor others in the area of, as is identified, of Zen, Sufism, and all the mystery cores of Christianity and Judaism. There are tales of it. And so some of you may have seen names of several other people, but the stories are not that uncommon of being martyred for being martyred for beliefs, but not extreme in the sense that they're now judged to be insane or irrational. It was just at the time that the idea seemed to be so forceful, so unusual, so intolerable that the messenger of the message was eliminated. Well, let me point out that that is not necessary. There were several news items tonight having to do with radio transmissions. And one of them said that when it comes to men's mental airwaves, that life will tolerate spasmodic supertransmissions as long as it keeps a cap on the number of potential listeners. That the idea of someone who to give it a shorthand name to press on, assume that there are people who pop up that know the secret or know astounding information about life. Let's just call it that for a moment. They assume that that is literally true, that that's what, and from ordinary views, that's what most people would think of as a Jesus or any mystic. That he, if you take away for a moment the notion of his divineness or semi-divineness, that he was just, if we're doing it on the basis of the message, and the words he said was too drastic, then you could look at that as being a kind of super transmission, that he knew something and he started talking about it and he shouldn't have done that. And that therefore life, just had to do away with him. That sounds nice. As I said, all would-be mystics still just almost wet their little pants when they think about that. It just sounds so explanatory, so exculpatory, if you'll know the truth, that it helps explain away why I'm not doing any better. Perhaps life's protecting me because it couldn't stand if I talked about any more. If I was any smarter and more awake and enlightened than I am, life probably wouldn't put up with me. So I guess it's a good thing that, I'm no more popular than I am just right here in the general metro area of Topeka, Kansas. But one more time, may I remind you, as always, I'm going to press on with what appears to be actual hardwired, real historical examples and figures, and I'm not talking about that at all. They may not have even existed, but you've got to start somewhere. So, and it all is operationally referential to what goes on inside of one person's mind. But the question that, or the observation, the view that life would take a Jesus, just for instance, and just absolutely do away with him. Like, you can't talk like that. You can't tell people that kind of stuff. All such stories, hit it from several ways, all such stories are strictly composed after the fact. That was not the way, again, you got to remember, assuming it even took place, which is not the point, but keep it in mind that even if it took place as described, more or less, part of it didn't take place as described, because any overt action any harsh resistance that life may have played or could have played to an individual such as Jesus was not played out at the time. It did not happen in real time if it happened. The stories were composed. The reality of what happened, quote, reality of what happened, was composed after it happened. Or, for those of you getting better, the, quote, reality of what happened after it happened. But, now I'll take a few steps to a few degrees in some other direction. Let's try it another way. It didn't actually happen like that, because it does not have to happen like that. Within the closed system of life, or within life itself, within this game from which there's no escape, into which you're born, and extrinsic to which man cannot drag in any other information, any other game pieces, any other moves, it's already there. If it's not there, it doesn't exist. So life does not have to suppress, much less do away with, a man, an individual presenting, quote, information that's too strong. It can stand, even if that happens. It can abide and tolerate spasmodic super transmissions. Because all it's got to do is keep a lid on the number of people with the potential ability to pick it up, to turn their radio in and hear it. Do you understand? It is an absolute waste of time, would be a waste of time, for life to look down, to take these stories and look down at a Jesus or a Socrates and go, well, this is getting out of hand. You know, I'm going to arrange, I know what I'll do. I'll get a whole bunch of Romans, and I'll get them to get in concert with some of the Jewish religious leaders, some of the Orthodox, the sane people, those with the right idea of reality, and I'll get them to get together and talk about it a while, and I'll get the rabbis to plant the seeds of doubt in the civil authorities, the Romans' mind, that Jesus is actually speaking metaphorically about political rebellion. So I get them going, and then I get the rabbis to keep stirring up ideas that Jesus is a heretic. I get all stirred up, and I'll make the times get a little uneasy anyway, and the Roman Empire is beginning to have cracks out of its edges, and I'll encourage some of that. I'll see to it that Hadrian's Wall is crumbling even at an increasing rate of speed. I'll do all of this, and finally it'll culminate in some way, if I got it played just right, that they'll decide, why don't we just try Jesus? We'll think up some kind of charge and try him. All it's got to do is do this. Just be sure, which is normally arranged that way anyway. Remember, the Newsime says all it's got to do is still keep a cap on the number of people with the potential ability to receive the transmissions. So it's already got that. All it's got to do is not change anything. That should a Jesus, should someone with the ability to send out super transmissions, should they pop up, should life let it happen, it does not have to go through all of this complex Machiavellian intrigue to do away with him. All it's got to do is keep things as it is, as they are, to wit, that very few people, a limited number of people, can even hear what he's saying anyway. Life's efficient. Life doesn't have to fool around killing some guy. I might also add, by the way, Jesus and Socrates present two, at first blush, interesting contrast having to do with the temporal aspect of their life and adventure, let's say. Again, taking the stories as they seem to be written. Jesus had, by all the reports, like 35, 36, 37 years of his so-called ministry, that he was actually out there making these transmissions. That he only had that much, and then that was it. Socrates, by all equally valid accounts, Socrates did his shtick for, if I remember, he was in his 70s when he finally drank the big one. And by all reports, he'd been doing it as long as anybody could remember. So let's say, again, let's give him the same credit as Jesus, say that by the age of 15, 18, even 20, he was out there doing it. And so he did it for 50 years, almost twice as long. it would seem, if there is validity, the reason I bring this out is just to show you interesting things, ways in which commonly known historical myths or stories that even given that they have a potential mythical and metaphorical quality or potential to them, two of the well-known ones differ greatly in certain respects, but here's one that no one even considers, that life looked down at Jesus. And it just went on less than really a generation. And life just cut it off, like, that's enough. The man was just getting going good in his early 30s. Whereas life let Socrates wander and do the same thing until into his 70s. How can that be? If indeed it is a matter, as the question was originally presented, or the rhetorical musing, that life will not tolerate this sort of thing, that life will cut it down. Now, even if that's true, why this great disparity between Jesus' being allowed to do it for 15 years, and a Socrates being allowed to do it for 50 years or more? Nobody has an answer? I'm going to leave it. There was a point to that. It was supposed to be up to you to... There was another aspect of the question that I said someone sort of brought up, presented to me. And it had to do with, again, taking the basis, and it's tied to one of these news items, taking as a basis the acceptance of the Jesus and Socrates and other stories of martyrdom, take them as presented, literally. Then the person further presented the kind of musing that such people, if they did exist, that what they put out, the messages they were sending, I was calling it super transmission in the news item that happened to coincide. But the question was presented, is it not a fact that such people are, even though they may be aiding life's expansion, that what they're doing specifically, individually at that time, is just too much? I mean, it's just too much of a good thing, you might say. They're just overdoing it. Well, what do you think? There's several things. One I've already mentioned is life keeps an acceptable lid on the number of people that can receive, that have the potential to hear the message, to hear what's being said, to hear the transmission. Because you've always got a matter of, let's use it as a metaphor again, like radio broadcast. It does no good. It's not even existent, functionally speaking, unless there is someone out there with a radio, unless there's someone with a receiver. What does it matter what station's on the air? What does it matter how much wattage they put out? What does it matter how tall is their antenna and how far is their reach? What does it matter what's being broadcast? What if it is of supreme importance? What if it is declarations of war? What if it's warnings of natural calamities? What if it's secret information? All of that is absolutely moot, as if there were conditions of mootness. But it is moot unless there's at least one receiver somewhere. So the transmission of anything cannot be considered apart from the ability of someone to receive same. So the idea that there is certain information that is too strong, too much, and yet it in some way is probably, or they were sort of asking, is it not still in some way related to the continual evolution of life? Yes, no, maybe, yes, 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 no, maybe, yes, yes, definitely yes. Tune in tomorrow. It is that, again, if we take anything, of course, everything going on in man's mental world that is part of the collective reality of man, is over a long range conducive and a part of life's gradual expansion. But to get a bit more specifically, the kinds of things, as people have suspected, contained in the apparent messages of mystics was more specifically a foretelling of the future. I'll put it to you another way. The message is always, in part, anachronistic. Anachronistic, in the common use of the term, as some of you probably know, is normally, means a displacement, a misuse, a misidentification of a time area. But it's normally used, almost exclusively, was normally used as to misplace a date related to the past. In other words, an inverted anachronism, that you have a date misplaced, but it's generally used to say that someone is speaking anachronistically. Forget the date, that's too specific, but it still refers, the way it's generally used is a reference to it backward looking. So if you say that someone's message is anachronistic, almost all of the time you are referring to that their message is out of date. But still out of date, if you begin to follow this, still needs qualifications, but by connotation, out of date means it's too old. That someone's simply repeating something that's already past its day. But for me to point out that the message of any mystic is always in part anachronistic, the rest of that news item, that the message of every mystic is in part anachronistic, but is always in full forward-looking. That is, the anachronism is that what's being said is not out of date vis-a-vis that it's something that's too old, that it's out of date already. It is something that's out of date, yes, but it's something, it is a telling of what is coming up. It is a displacement of something being said that is not yet available to common perception. And so it is an anachronism. The more anachronistic it is, the more future looking it is, the less trouble life has with it, because the fewer people who can hear it. And so the less life has to keep any eye on this occurring. The less life has any concern over, well, I got to watch this guy, I got to watch this one transmitter because he or she may be spilling the beans too much. It should be of some interest to any of you following this metaphorically, or even it's got to be metaphorically, but even taking the literal interpretation, the literal retelling of all the martyrdom stories of Jesus and Socrates, for instance, as to what the stories say was their downfall, what actually triggered local reality to do away with them. What was it? An Athenian pre-AD time that made taking Athens as being a metaphor for the center, or at least the cutting edge of civilization of the time, that made these fine people of Athens, the epitome of civilization at the time, what made them, again, remember, since none of you seem to have liked it much, I got to point out, what made them suddenly, over a period of 50 or 60 years of it going on, suddenly decide that Socrates is, and what he's saying, not the man, but what he's saying is a potential, there is a disruptive influence. And then notice the story of Jesus, but how about Socrates for a second? Again, you might also consider why it is of such little popularity compared to a Jesus story. But Socrates, according to the indictment that the Athenian Senate made against him, was that his comments were disruptive to civil order and potentially dangerous to the youth of Athens, which is If I'd tried to make it up, I couldn't have beat that. And they did it without my help. It is disruptive to the public order, to the civic order. Yes. Now that is if it had actually gotten out of hand. But anyway, this is even what spurred them after 50 years of people saying, would you calm that down? And according to stories also, there was something else going on. Are we getting to be even smaller Russian dolls within what you thought was the smallest Russian doll when I started? Nah, we can keep going. According to the stories, again, I'll take them as they are, with everyone's infinite number of tongues in your own cheek. But the stories, remember, of Socrates in general, even though he was known as being a hanger around of the public marketplace, the history, that which Plato and others considered to be worthy of recording, was not ordinary people, but the extraordinary, the leaders of Athenian society, of civil society, thinkers, politicians, warriors, poets, that all of the stories that were recorded were of him in private. I mean, I know there's some mention of him being out and talking to people, and they say he did it all the time. But nobody even bothered to record those. What they recorded was Socrates being invited, just an ordinary, by all stories, unpretentious. He never tried to measure up. He never tried to fit in. But he, by all the stories, just take them as they are, he was invited continually to the best of private affairs. A world-famous poet, someone who just won a prize, a general coming back from victorious campaigns, someone a newly appointed or elected official of Athens. They'd have a big party, a private party. The riffraff's not invited, a private party, and he was always invited. They would invite him there in private and talk to him. And yet, remember, they did eventually, publicly get out publicly and indict him. Even though they took him aside again and said, listen, we don't want to do this. We got no interest in doing this. But notice up until the point of his trial, up until the point that life at the local level had had enough. Up to that point, notice the same people, the leaders, the supporters of civility, of law and order, are those very ones that sought him out and continually invited him to their private affairs so that they could engage in this, what was later to be known as Socratic dialogue with him. And yet, those same people operating on the behest, unbeknownst to them, of life, had to eventually publicly denounce him for doing that very thing, for doing the very thing for which they invited him to private parties. They didn't say that he juggled or played the piano. They invited him there to gab with him. And then they eventually had to publicly say, listen, you got to quit this gabbing. It is disruptive of the public order, and you are spoiling. You're spoiling the minds of the young. The minds of the young, of course, you can always look at as being not just the young, but simultaneously with just the young physically, as fresher generations, which are always more amenable to hearing something new. And here it is, a 70-year-old guy still talking about this stuff, and 70-year-olds, his peers, are probably not going to pay any attention. But if he catches the ear of some 20-year-olds coming around, they're able to hear things. Not that the good fathers of Athens understood this. Life understood it. But a 20-year-old coming along to the strange side of a 70-year-old still being conscious and still struggling to ride that train. He was supposed to have been, if not dead, propped up in a wheelchair with a walker, at least at home, minding his own business, watching TV. But here this man is 70, still out and consciously alive and still talking the talk and walking the walk. And the Senate had to point out, you are spoiling. You are contaminating the minds of the young. If you want another doll with another doll, some of you probably know history now, or some histories try and say that what they were really speaking about and indicting him for was code words for he was gay, and that he was spoiling the sexual morals of young men. Don't they wish? I mean, that's always a nice story after the fact. Well, no wonder they killed the man. He was funny. He was weird. I mean, he had some kind of sexual perversion, right. He was about to cause a revolution. Good, yeah, that's true. Plus, he was real ugly. Well, there you are. I mean, what other ammunition do you need? Anyway, it was true. It always is true under the given conditions. Should an anachronistic, that is a futuristic message, that is of someone transmitting information which in fact is describing what the parade's going to be like around the next corner, right down the street, right over the horizon, everybody's marching down, and the transmission is coming from the future. The descriptions are describing the future. At the time, life keeps. All it's got to do is keep a lid on the number of people who can potentially hear the information. So you got that. But now do you see any connection, or why I kept bringing up, or twice I brought the idea of Jesus was, according to the stories, was slain at a very early age. That life in his time and place only let him get by with it for 15 or so years, whereas life let Socrates get by with it for almost a damn lifetime. But see, Socrates is, again, all of his peers, anywhere near his peerage, anywhere near his age, not only should he have already been done for and walking around in a serious state of near deadness. In other words, he should be acting like a 70-year-old person, damn it. Which is basically how most 40-year-old people should be walking around, except you're hunched over more. But up here, you know, you're supposed to bend over all that. So, not only that, but life can also count the fact that all of his peers are supposed to be also. But here's a guy, if you're going to take it literally and then put it metaphorically inside of your own noggin, here's a guy still alive while he's alive, still alive at the age of 70. And his peers, we'll assume the fine fathers of Athens, the living exponents of external local conditions, civil, sane, sequential order, we'll assume that they were of his same age. They finally, as much as they seem to enjoy him individually and in private, life made them publicly say, you got to stop this. But now consider if life does have to be concerned over watching that this kind of information doesn't get out, what in the hell was life doing there for 50 or 60 years? Why did it let Socrates wander around and do all this if it is such a potentially pressing matter that we must watch at all times to keep down the subversion? Of course, some of you chuckle like, well, that doesn't make sense. But then you're faced with this. You want to take another type story. Now jump forward to Jesus, him doing a similar thing. Life didn't let him go on for all those years. But in a short period of time, it was as though life said, that's enough. In both cases, what people are talking about is something out of the norm. They are talking about the future. Now consider, in the waning moments, for those of you that like to wane, that was close. Well, that was to make up for those of you that didn't like Fred and his blender. I don't know what else you can expect out of people who do not really care for choirs anyway. But consider all of this on the basis of one person's own thought processes, that your own picturing that, you know what that is, picturing everything that constitutes you mentally, your mental world individually. There it is. There's Athens. There is Canaan. There is Athens. And within Athens, the norm is order. The norm is reality as perceived by the good, sane, hardworking, everyday Athenians. That is the norm within you. How much toleration can your individual Athens, the norm, the good people, the Senate, the everyday hardworking, right-thinking, worship the gods, don't ask unanswerable questions, don't mess with the young, don't confuse people, part of your mind, which is what a person ordinarily considers, it's what they feel when they say I, when they say their name, when they think of themselves as being an individual, they're thinking about the good, sane people of Athens. How much toleration do you have? Asking rhetorically on a generic basis, theoretical basis, but how much toleration do you have for Socrates? And I know that many people who believe they're interested in such as this will insist, well, whip it on me. I got a great toleration. In fact, there'd be people, I'm sure, that would listen to such as occurring here and say, well, there's not enough of an upsetting nature. Not often enough do you speak about spirits, UFOs, and the return of Jesus, perhaps. Weirdness, spookiness. That's not the point. There is a balance. There is a toleration that is built in to the people of Athens, that is built into the norm of what a person thinks. The norm being that their agreement, which if you're sane, you've got no choice in it. You grow up in agreement, more or less, with the common collective conception of what is reality and everything therein. That is, what is proper, what is true, what is reasonable to think about, what's a waste of time to think about, what's good to talk about, what you shouldn't fool with. All of that is a part of your stable Athenian society. It is a part of the milieu of a Jesus. But then it's how much toleration does the local authorities, does local collective reality, the norm, have for any extraordinary ideas? And I'll answer it for you. Almost none. In fact, it being on a wider scale, if you take the stories of a Socrates, Athens had more toleration for unusual ideas from a Socrates, to wit 50 or 60 years worth, than most individuals can ever muster. And yet, does anyone recall that those who never get on the mystical express are the most likely, when asked, will say, yeah, hop aboard, I want to hop aboard. They're the ones that think, well, it's got to be stranger, it's got to be weirder. If it gets too weird, it is not of any value. You're back to that fine kind of line. Surely you can guess, we can all imagine, and your imagination is quite well founded, that in Athens at the same time as Socrates, hanging around down there at the Acropolis, you know damn well with some homeless people, guys on Thunderbird drinking Mad Dog that wander around mumbling about they're talking to people from other planets or from Mongolia, people who are nutso. Athens, the good people, the Senate never had to condemn them. They didn't have to run them off the street. They don't have to go and tell them to shut up. And that's the danger, or that's the captious area, wherein many people who think that they would like to travel on the great mythical express, but they'll never get on it, they're the very ones that'll go, if inviters say, hey, would you like to hop aboard? They go, damn right. But the hop aboard is always on some sort of strange verbal excursion, such as, we're going to Venus. It is always that sort that is publicly offered. The words of a Socrates, a message of a mystic that is actually in tune with the future, what he's saying. Life doesn't have to worry. His following, the hearing is always going to be limited. And life does not have to cut down on it. Indeed, those who would try to hear it have got to in some way cut up on it. It is not of any great significance, as always, literally. But people give credit after the fact, people who think they're interested in such things as a Jesus. They give more credit than it was due, simultaneously remembering that I'm speaking of it as though it actually happened, and also simultaneously speaking of it as a metaphor. But you would look around now at the population of the planet, and I forget what it is. I know Christianity is, by all statistics, the largest denomination. So let's say, I don't know what it is, 3 out of 10 people or 4 out of 10 people are Christians. And so you could look at it and think, well, my God, and not even be religious. You could just look at the figures and try to be an academic about it, try to be objective and say, well, whatever the hell Jesus was talking about, or whoever the hell he was, there's no doubt he had one hell of an impact. Because look at it, 4/10 of the world's population profess to be believers in what he said. Then I could put that same person, I'd say, well, if that be the case, then think what an impact. I mean, he's dead. He's been dead 2,000 years, and 4/10 of the world's population profess to be followers of him. You go, yeah, whatever the hell it was, it's something. You go, hey, if that happened, and he's been dead 2,000 years, think about the impact he had when he was alive. Now, people don't analyze it, but if you ask them, people did in religion and people who are